World War II stands as the most cataclysmic conflict in human history, a global conflagration that engulfed nearly every corner of the Earth and left an indelible scar on the 20th century. This 13-part narrative, The Origins and Course of World War II, seeks to unravel the complex tapestry of events, decisions, and ideologies that led to this unprecedented war, and to chart its harrowing course from the first rumblings of aggression to the final, devastating conclusion. We begin by examining the unresolved tensions and lingering resentments of the First World War, the rise of extremist ideologies in Europe and Asia, and the failure of international institutions to prevent the slide towards war. We will explore the key events that ignited the conflict, from the invasion of Poland to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and trace the strategies, battles, and turning points that defined its brutal trajectory. From the blitzkrieg across Europe to the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific, from the icy battlefields of the Eastern Front to the deadly skies over Britain, this narrative will delve into the experiences of soldiers and civilians alike, highlighting the courage, sacrifice, suffering, and resilience of those caught in the maelstrom. We will also confront the war's darkest chapters, including the Holocaust, the atomic bombings, and the countless atrocities that stained its legacy. Ultimately, this narrative aims not only to recount the events of World War II, but also to understand its enduring significance. By exploring its origins and tracing its course, we seek to grapple with the profound questions it raises about human nature, the fragility of peace, and the enduring quest for a more just and stable world. Part 1. The Seeds of Conflict. The story of World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history, claiming the lives of an estimated 70 to 85 million people, does not begin in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Its roots lie deep within the bruised and embittered earth of Europe, specifically in the aftermath of World War I, a global conflagration that had ended just 2 decades prior, in 1918, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty, painstakingly crafted by the victorious Allied powers, was intended to ensure a lasting peace, to prevent the recurrence of such a cataclysm. Yet, in its punitive measures and its failure to adequately address the underlying tensions that had plagued Europe for centuries, it instead sowed the very seeds of resentment and instability, particularly within the heart of Germany. Germany, having endured the immense loss of life and resources in the preceding war, was forced to accept terms of surrender that were viewed by many Germans as a crippling humiliation, a diktat imposed upon them. The nation suffered significant territorial losses, including Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, and parts of its eastern territories ceded to a newly re-established Poland. It was burdened with massive reparations payments, an astronomical sum meant to compensate the Allied powers for the war's damages, which effectively crippled its economy for years to come. Furthermore, severe restrictions were placed on its military. Its army was limited to 100,000 men, its navy drastically reduced, and it was forbidden from possessing an air force. The once proud German nation, still reeling from the defeat, found itself economically prostrate, its people shamed, and its political landscape deeply fractured. The fledgling Weimar Republic, established in the chaotic wake of the war, struggled desperately to maintain order amidst rampant hyperinflation, the constant threat of political extremism from both the far left and the far right, and widespread social unrest born of poverty and despair. It was in this volatile climate of profound despair, simmering resentment, and popular disillusionment that the unseen seeds of a new and more terrible conflict were sown, silently germinating in the fertile ground of national humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles, for all its grand aspirations, also failed to adequately address the rising ambitions of other powerful nations. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt a deep sense of betrayal, believing it had not been sufficiently rewarded with territorial gains for its considerable participation and sacrifices in the war. This grievance fueled a sense of aggrieved nationalism that would later be exploited by opportunistic leaders. Far across the globe, Japan, an island nation with a rapidly industrializing economy but severely limited natural resources, increasingly sought to expand its territory and influence across Asia, viewing the vast resources of China and Southeast Asia as essential for its future prosperity and regional dominance. The League of Nations, an international organization optimistically formed after World War I with the noble aim of preventing future wars through collective security and diplomacy, proved to be tragically ineffective. It lacked the necessary power, the unified resolve, and critically, the military enforcement capabilities to intervene decisively when aggressive nations began to challenge the international order. The world, still exhausted, traumatized, and desperately yearning for peace after the Great War, was thus tragically ill-prepared for the insidious rise of aggressive, expansionist ideologies and the virulent resurgence of narrow-minded nationalism that would soon and inexorably plunge it into an even greater, more destructive catastrophe. Part 2. The Rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. In the midst of Germany's profound economic and political turmoil, a small and initially obscure political party began its insidious ascent, slowly but surely gaining traction among a disillusioned populace: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, more commonly known as the Nazi Party. Founded in the early 1920s, amidst the chaotic backdrop of post-war Germany, the party quickly coalesced around a toxic and virulent blend of extreme nationalism, aggressive racism, and virulent anti-Semitism. Its core message was simplistic but potent. It systematically blamed Germany's myriad problems: the crippling reparations, the economic collapse, the national humiliation, squarely on the Treaty of Versailles, the perceived weakness of the Weimar Republic, and, most nefariously, on scapegoats such as Jews, communists, and other minority groups. At the helm of this rapidly growing party was Adolf Hitler, an Austrian-born demagogue with an almost hypnotic, charismatic speaking style and a ruthless, unyielding ambition that seemed to know no bounds. Born on the 20th of April, 1889, in the small Austrian town of Braunau am Inn, near the border with Germany, Hitler's early life was marked by a deeply strained and often abusive relationship with his father, Owa, a rigid customs official. He nurtured an early but ultimately unfulfilled interest in art, experiencing bitter rejection from the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts Vienna not once, but twice. These profound rejections, coupled with a period of grinding poverty and anonymity in Vienna, where he spent his days in flofusses and absorbed the pervasive anti-Semitic sentiments of the time, gradually fueled his deep-seated resentment and contributed significantly to the dark, conspiratorial worldview he was meticulously constructing. Hitler enthusiastically volunteered for service in the German army during World War I, an experience that profoundly shaped his political views and solidified his extreme nationalist convictions. He served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front, was wounded twice, and received the Iron Cross First Class, a rare and prestigious decoration for a corporal, indicating his bravery under fire. The devastating defeat of Germany in 1918, which he perceived as a betrayal from within, and the subsequent imposition of the Treaty of Versailles left him deeply embittered and convinced that Germany had been stabbed in the back by its own leaders and various internal enemies. After the war, deeply traumatized and radicalized, Hitler joined the nascent German Workers' Party, which he soon, through his relentless energy and captivating oratory, transformed into the formidable Nazi Party. His exceptional oratorical skills, his ability to whip crowds into a frenzy with passionate, hateful speeches, and his uncanny knack for tapping into the widespread discontent, fear, and resentment of the masses, allowed him to rapidly rise through the party's ranks. In November of 1923, driven by an impetuous desire for immediate power, he attempted to seize control of the Bavarian government in a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch. This audacious but poorly executed attempt resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. It was during his incarceration, serving only a fraction of his 5-year sentence, that he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a sprawling, venomous manifesto meticulously outlining his warped political ideology, his fervent anti-Semitism, and his grandiose, terrifying plans for the future of Germany and Europe. Upon his early release from prison, Hitler, having learned a valuable lesson from his failed coup, reorganized the Nazi Party with chilling efficiency and adopted a new, more insidious strategy, gaining power through legal, democratic means, subverting the very system he despised from within. The onset of the Great Depression, which began with the Wall Street crash in October of 1929 and quickly plunged the global economy into a severe downturn, further destabilized the fragile Weimar Republic. The ensuing economic devastation, mass unemployment, rampant poverty, and widespread hunger created an even more fertile ground for extremist ideologies like Nazism, which offered radical solutions and scapegoats for the nation's suffering. The Nazi Party capitalized on this despair, gaining an increasing number of seats in the Reichstag, the German parliament, in successive elections. Their electoral successes were fueled by their effective propaganda, their paramilitary street violence against political opponents, and the utter failure of mainstream parties to address the deepening crisis. Finally, after a series of political maneuvers and backroom deals, on the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. Within a mere few months, he had cunningly consolidated his power, systematically dismantled the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic through legislative acts like the Enabling Act, suppressed all opposition, and established a brutal, totalitarian dictatorship known as the Third Reich, marking the beginning of a terrifying new era for Germany and the world. Part 3: The Foundations of Nazi Ideology and the Cult of Personality. The Nazi regime's ideology was not merely a political platform, it was a totalizing, all-encompassing worldview rooted in a grotesque and pseudoscientific vision of racial purity and national supremacy. At its core was the fanatical belief in the absolute superiority of the so-called Aryan race, a concept that was conveniently vague but generally encompassed Germanic peoples, specifically those with blonde hair and blue eyes, though many prominent Nazis, including Hitler himself, did not fit this idealized physical mold. This warped ideology posited a rigid, hierarchical view of humanity, with the Aryans positioned at the apex, destined to rule. All other groups, particularly Jews, but also Roma people, Slavs, and various other minorities, were systematically deemed as untermenschen, or subhuman, and perceived as an existential threat to the purity and strength of the German nation. Antisemitism, a venomous, deeply ingrained hatred of Jews, was not just a component, but rather the central, pulsating artery of Nazi ideology. This hatred was not new to Europe, but the Nazis amplified and weaponized it with unprecedented fervor and systemic brutality. However, the Nazis' racism was far-reaching and encompassed other forms of prejudice. They also targeted the Romani people, Gypsies, whom they deemed racially impure and socially undesirable. Slavs, including Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians, were viewed as inferior races fit only for servitude or extermination, particularly in the context of the Lebensraum expansion plans. Homosexuals, disabled people, both physical and mental, political dissidents, Jehovah's Witnesses, and habitual criminals were also systematically persecuted and deemed enemies of the state. This comprehensive racist worldview was inextricably combined with a virulent, aggressive form of ultranationalism that glorified the German nation, its history, and its supposed destiny to expand and dominate over all other peoples and territories. Hitler and the Nazis meticulously cultivated the belief that Germany had been fundamentally wronged by history, particularly by the stab-in-the-back myth following World War I and the crushing terms of the Treaty of Versailles. They propagated the idea that Germany was entitled to expand its territory and power exponentially to reclaim its rightful place as the preeminent power in Europe and eventually the world. This aggressive, expansionist vision was explicitly linked to the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, which Hitler explicitly stated Germany needed to acquire primarily in the vast, fertile plains of Eastern Europe, at the expense of the Slavic populations residing there. This territory would provide the resources and agricultural land necessary to sustain Germany's burgeoning population and future military machine, fulfilling its supposed destiny. The Nazi ideology was disseminated through an incredibly sophisticated and pervasive propaganda machine, meticulously crafted and relentlessly driven by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The regime exercised absolute control over all forms of public communication and media, including newspapers, radio, film, theater, and art, using them as powerful tools to relentlessly indoctrinate the German people with its hateful, supremacist, and expansionist message. Radio sets were distributed widely, broadcasting Hitler's speeches into every home. Films like Triumph of the Will glorified the Nazi movement and its leader. Rallies, parades, and other elaborate mass events, such as the annual Nuremberg rallies, were meticulously staged to create an overwhelming sense of national unity, collective purpose, and enthusiastic devotion to the Nazi cause and to Hitler himself. The Heil Hitler salute became mandatory, and dissent was brutally suppressed. Through this relentless and all-encompassing propaganda, a powerful cult of personality was forged around Adolf Hitler, presenting him as the infallible Führer, the savior of the German nation, and the embodiment of its glorious destiny, captivating millions and paving the way for the horrors to come. Part 4: The Persecution of the Jews, from Discrimination to Isolation. The Nazi regime's anti-Semitic policies escalated with chilling speed and methodical precision after Hitler's rise to power, transforming from hateful rhetoric into systematic, state-sponsored discrimination and violence. In April of 1933, barely 3 months after Hitler became Chancellor, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed, marking the first major anti-Jewish legislation. This law expelled Jews from civil service positions, including teachers, doctors, and lawyers, effectively barring them from participating in key sectors of German society and dismantling their livelihoods. Jewish businesses were subjected to organized boycotts, often enforced by Nazi stormtroopers, and Jewish books, particularly those deemed un-German, were publicly burned in massive bonfires, symbolizing the regime's intent to eradicate Jewish cultural and intellectual influence. The infamous Nuremberg Laws, enacted on the 15th of September 1935 during a Nazi Party rally, further codified and entrenched this discrimination with brutal clarity. These two laws, the Right Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, stripped Jews of their German citizenship, effectively making them stateless persons in their own land. They were defined not by their religion or cultural practices, but by their ancestry, with anyone having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents deemed Jewish. These laws deprived Jews of basic rights, forbidding them from voting, holding public office, or marrying or having sexual relations with non-Jewish Germans. This was a critical step in their systematic dehumanization, isolating them from the rest of German society and setting them apart for further persecution. Public spaces, parks, swimming pools, and even benches were marked for Aryans only, enforcing segregation and humiliation. The pace of persecution quickened. Jewish property was increasingly confiscated, Jewish doctors were barred from treating non-Jewish patients, and Jewish children were systematically expelled from public schools, forcing them into separate, inferior educational institutions. Jews were subjected to increasing violence and humiliation in public, often at the hands of Nazi youth groups or the SA stormtroopers, with little to no intervention from the authorities. The goal was clear: to systematically isolate, impoverish, and terrorize the Jewish population, pushing them to emigrate, a policy initially favored by the regime. The persecution of Jews escalated dramatically and violently on the 9th and 10th of November 1938 in an orchestrated pogrom known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. This coordinated attack, ostensibly a spontaneous outpouring of public anger following the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish teenager in Paris, was in fact meticulously planned and executed by Nazi stormtroopers, SS members, and civilian sympathizers, often dressed in plain clothes. Across Germany and Austria, Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were ransacked, looted, and burned, leaving a literal trail of broken glass from shattered windows on the streets. Over 90 Jews were murdered, and thousands more were brutally assaulted. Crucially, on the nights and days immediately following Kristallnacht, approximately 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. This event marked a terrifying shift from social discrimination and legal marginalization to overt state-sponsored violence and mass incarceration, signaling to the Jewish population, and indeed to the world, the terrifying future that awaited them. Part 5: The concentration camps and the early stages of mass murder. The concentration camps established by the Nazi regime were not merely prisons. They were a central, evolving tool of persecution, terror, forced labor, and ultimately systematic mass murder. Initially, these camps served to detain political opponents, communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other dissidents who posed a threat to Hitler's new totalitarian regime. However, their purpose rapidly expanded, and they soon became instruments for the systematic imprisonment and extermination of Jews, Roma people, homosexuals, disabled individuals, both physical and mental, Jehovah's Witnesses, habitual criminals, and other groups deemed undesirable or enemies of the state by the Nazis' warped ideology. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened its gates in March of 1933, barely 2 months after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor. Over time, The camp system expanded rapidly and terrifyingly, metastasizing across Germany and later occupied Europe, with hundreds of main camps and thousands of sub-camps established by the SS. These camps varied significantly in their specific purpose and operational focus, ranging from forced labor camps, where prisoners were worked to death in brutal conditions for the Nazi war machine, to transit camps, which served as temporary holding centers before deportation to other more sinister destinations, and ultimately to the horrifying extermination camps, designed specifically for the industrial-scale mass murder of targeted groups. Conditions within all concentration camps were universally horrific, characterized by unimaginable suffering and systematic dehumanization. Prisoners were subjected to extreme starvation, living on meager rations of watered-down soup and stale bread that barely sustained life. Rampant disease such as typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked due to overcrowding, lack of sanitation, and weakened immune systems, leading to countless deaths. Forced labor, often arduous and pointless, was designed to exploit prisoners until they collapsed from exhaustion. Torture, both physical and psychological, was commonplace, inflicted by sadistic guards and capos prisoner functionaries. Prisoners were crammed into filthy, overcrowded barracks, denied basic sanitation, and subjected to the arbitrary whims of the SS guards, who wielded absolute power over life and death. Medical experiments, often involving extreme cruelty and a complete disregard for human life, were conducted on prisoners, ranging from studies on hypothermia and high-altitude sickness to the deliberate infection with diseases and grotesque surgical procedures, all without anesthesia or ethical considerations. The systematic terror and brutality were designed to break the human spirit, to render prisoners into mere numbers, devoid of identity or will, preparing them for their ultimate fate. Part 6. The Holocaust, the final solution unfolds. World War II tragically provided the Nazis with the horrifying opportunity to implement their final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic, state-sponsored, industrial-scale extermination of the Jewish people of Europe. The Holocaust, as this genocide is known, stands as one of the darkest and most horrific crimes in human history, a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity. The invasion of Poland in September of 1939 brought millions of Jews under immediate Nazi control. These Jewish populations were initially confined to overcrowded, unsanitary, and tightly controlled urban areas known as ghettos. Conditions within the ghettos were appalling. Starvation, rampant disease, and brutal forced labor became the daily reality, designed to weaken and decimate the Jewish population. The Warsaw Ghetto, for instance, housed nearly 500,000 people in an area less than 1.5 square miles, its inhabitants gradually succumbing to disease and famine. As the war progressed, and particularly with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis began to implement more radical and direct measures of mass murder. In June of 1941, immediately following the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, specialized mobile killing units, known as Einsatzgruppen, were deployed behind the advancing German lines. These units, comprised primarily of SS and police personnel, systematically rounded up Jewish populations in the conquered territories, along with Roma people, Soviet commissars, and other perceived enemies. These victims were then marched to secluded killing sites, often forests or ravines, where they were forced to dig their own mass graves before being murdered in cold blood by firing squads. Over 1.5 million Jews were killed by the Einsatzgruppen in mass shootings, often in broad daylight, marking the beginning of the Holocaust by bullets. The most infamous example is the Babi Yar massacre near Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days in September of 1941. The Wannsee Conference, held on the 20th of January 1942 in a villa on the outskirts of Berlin, formalized the Nazi plan for the complete annihilation of the European Jewish population. High-ranking Nazi officials, including Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, gathered to discuss the chilling logistics of the final solution. This conference established a bureaucratic and efficient system for the deportation, concentration, and extermination that would be used to eliminate every single Jew from Nazi-controlled Europe. The decision was made to shift from mass shootings to more efficient methods of killing in purpose-built extermination camps. Jews from across Germany and occupied Europe were systematically rounded up, often with the complicity of local authorities, and transported in overcrowded, unventilated cattle cars to extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Majdanek. These camps were constructed specifically for the purpose of mass murder, equipped with gas chambers, primarily using Zyklon B gas or carbon monoxide, where hundreds or even thousands of people were murdered at a time. The victims' bodies were then cremated in large ovens to erase the evidence. Beyond the gas chambers, prisoners were also killed by firing squads, through brutal forced labor in factories or quarries until they died of exhaustion, and as a result of rampant disease, starvation, and sadistic medical experiments. The scale of the genocide was staggering and unprecedented. By the end of the war in May of 1945, 6 million Jews, representing 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe before the war, had been systematically murdered. The Holocaust was not only a crime against the Jewish people but a crime against humanity, a stark and eternal reminder of the depths of human depravity and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked hatred, racial prejudice, and totalitarian ideologies. Part 7: Expansionism and Appeasement in Europe. Hitler's insatiable ambitions extended far beyond the brutal persecution of Jews and other minorities. He sought nothing less than to expand Germany's territory dramatically and create a vast, monolithic empire, a greater German Reich, that would dominate Europe and potentially the world. He fervently believed that Germany had been unjustly deprived of its rightful place and power in the world, a grievance he traced back to the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. Central to his vision was the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, which he openly stated Germany needed to acquire, primarily in the rich agricultural lands of Eastern Europe, at the direct expense of the Slavic populations residing there. This expansion was seen as essential for Germany's future prosperity, its racial purity, and its military might. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler embarked on a calculated series of aggressive moves, each one designed to test the resolve and unity of the other major European powers. In March of 1936, defying the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Treaties, he brazenly remilitarized the Rhineland, a strategically vital region bordering France that had been demilitarized after World War I. France, though militarily superior at the time, failed to act decisively, fearing a full-scale war and lacking British support. This inaction emboldened Hitler. In March of 1938, he orchestrated the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, a country with a predominantly German-speaking population. Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg's pleas for international support went unheeded, and German troops marched in virtually unopposed, consolidating Hitler's power and extending Germany's borders. Following the Anschluss, Hitler's gaze turned to Czechoslovakia. In September of 1938, he began to demand the annexation of the Sudetenland, a strategically important, heavily fortified, and ethnically German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. The leaders of Britain and France, Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier respectively, were haunted by the catastrophic memories of World War I, which had claimed millions of lives and decimated a generation. Desperate to avoid another global conflict at almost any cost, they adopted a policy of appeasement towards Hitler, believing that by making concessions to his stated demands, they could satisfy his territorial ambitions and thus prevent a devastating war. At the infamous Munich Conference, held on the 29th of September 1938, without any Czechoslovakian representation, they agreed to cede the Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Hitler offered hollow promises not to seek any further territorial gains in Europe. Chamberlain triumphantly returned to Britain, declaring peace for our time, a statement that would soon become a tragic epitaph for the appeasement policy. However, appeasement proved to be a disastrous and naive miscalculation. Hitler, far from being satisfied, was only emboldened by the perceived weakness and indecisiveness of the Western democracies. He saw their concessions as a sign of their unwillingness to fight, fueling his belief that he could pursue his expansionist agenda unchecked. He brazenly broke his promise and, in March of 1939, ordered German troops to invade and occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, dismantling the independent state entirely. This final act shattered any remaining illusions that Hitler's ambitions were limited to merely rectifying the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. It became starkly clear that his true aim was nothing less than the systematic conquest of Europe, and the world held its breath, knowing that war was now an almost inevitable reality. Part 8: Imperial Japan's Ambitions in Asia. While the storm clouds gathered ominously over Europe, a parallel and equally dangerous expansionist fervor was gripping East Asia, driven by the imperial ambitions of Japan. Unlike Germany, Japan was not seeking to overturn a punitive peace treaty, rather it was pursuing a long-held vision of dominance over its Asian neighbors, driven by a combination of economic necessity, militarist ideology, and a fervent belief in its own racial and cultural superiority. Japan, a rapidly industrializing island nation, possessed very limited natural resources, particularly vital raw materials like oil, rubber, and iron ore, which were crucial for its burgeoning industries and expanding military. This resource scarcity fueled a relentless drive for territorial expansion, particularly into resource-rich regions of China and Southeast Asia. Japan's imperial project had begun decades earlier with victories in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. Establishing its control over Korea, Taiwan, and parts of Manchuria. However, the 1930s saw a dramatic acceleration of its aggressive foreign policy, increasingly driven by militarist factions within the government who held significant influence over Emperor Hirohito. These militarists believed that Japan's destiny lay in creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a euphemism for a vast Japanese-dominated economic and political bloc that would free Asia from Western colonial influence but subjugate it to Japanese control. This vision was underpinned by an ultranationalist ideology known as Bushido, the way of the warrior, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and fierce, often fanatical, devotion to the emperor and the nation, glorifying military expansion. The first major step in this escalating aggression was the Mukden incident in September of 1931, a false flag operation orchestrated by the Japanese Kwantung Army, which used a fabricated explosion on a railway line as a pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria, a resource-rich region of northeastern China. Japan then established a puppet state there, Manchukuo, in 1932 despite international condemnation from the League of Nations, which Japan subsequently left in 1933. This act demonstrated the League's impotence and emboldened other aggressor nations. The full-scale invasion of China began in July of 1937 following the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing. This marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal and protracted conflict that would last for 8 long years and claim millions of Chinese lives. The Japanese Imperial Army, known for its ruthless efficiency, disciplined combat tactics, and often extreme brutality, quickly gained control of major Chinese cities and coastal areas, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. The rape of Nanjing in December of 1937 and January of 1938, where Japanese troops engaged in widespread atrocities, including mass murder, rape, and looting, shocked the world and became a symbol of Japanese wartime barbarity. Despite the vast size of China and the determined, though often poorly equipped, resistance from both nationalist and communist forces, Japan consolidated its hold over significant portions of the country. By the late 1930s, Japan's military machine was deeply entrenched in China, consuming vast resources and facing a prolonged, grinding war. With the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939, Japan saw a new opportunity to expand its influence in Southeast Asia, particularly targeting the colonial possessions of European powers Britain, France, and the Netherlands that were now preoccupied with the conflict on their own continent. These territories, rich in oil, rubber, tin, and other vital resources, were seen as the key to Japan's long-term survival and its dominance in the Pacific. This aggressive expansion, increasingly clashing with American interests in the region, set the stage for a much larger, global conflict in the Pacific. Part 9: The World Engulfed, From Europe to the Pacific. The final catastrophic act that plunged the world into its second global conflict in less than a quarter century was Germany's invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Adolf Hitler had long coveted Poland, which he saw not only as a historically lost German territory but also as a crucial stepping stone in his master plan to acquire Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, a vital component of his racial and imperial ambitions. To neutralize any immediate threat from the Soviet Union, his ideological enemy, Hitler astutely signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, on the 23rd of August, 1939. This pact, which secretly included protocols for the division of Poland and other Eastern European territories into German and Soviet spheres of influence, shocked the world and cleared the path for Hitler's invasion. Britain and France, having finally recognized the abject failure and tragic futility of their appeasement policy, had unequivocally pledged to defend Poland's sovereignty. When Germany launched its invasion, deploying the revolutionary Blitzkrieg lightning war tactics, a coordinated assault combining rapid tank advances, motorized infantry, and overwhelming air support, they swiftly declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. World War II had officially begun. The blitzkrieg tactics proved devastatingly effective, overwhelming Poland's defenses within weeks, and the country was brutally divided between Germany and the Soviet Union as per their secret agreement. The conflict then erupted across Europe. In April of 1940, Germany swiftly invaded and conquered Denmark and Norway, securing strategic naval bases and access to vital iron ore routes. The true shock came in May of 1940 when the German Wehrmacht launched its invasion of France, bypassing the formidable Maginot Line by attacking through the Ardennes forest. France, despite its strong army, quickly collapsed, signing an armistice in June of 1940. Britain, now under the resolute leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, stood alone against the Nazi onslaught, facing the imminent threat of invasion across the English Channel. The Battle of Britain, an intense aerial campaign fought over the skies of England in the summer and autumn of 1940, became a crucial turning point as the Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, heroically repelled the Luftwaffe, thwarting Hitler's invasion plans. However, the war's scope dramatically broadened on the 7th of December 1941 when Imperial Japan, executing a carefully planned surprise attack, launched a devastating assault on Pearl Harbor, a major United States naval base in Hawaii. This audacious act, which crippled a significant portion of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was intended to cripple American naval power and buy Japan time to secure its conquests in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, notably the resource-rich Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. Japan's immediate goal was to establish a vast defensive perimeter and create the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere free from Western influence, a move that directly clashed with American strategic interests in the Pacific. President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously declared the 7th of December 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The attack united a previously isolationist American public, and the very next day, on the 8th of December 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, Germany and Italy, bound by the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States, effectively transforming what had largely been a European conflict into a truly global conflagration, with fronts spanning across Europe, North Africa, the Atlantic, and the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Part 10. The Pacific War, Naval Dominance and Island Hopping. The entry of the United States into the war fundamentally shifted the global balance of power, creating two primary theaters. The European theater, focused on defeating Nazi Germany, and the Pacific theater, centered on confronting Imperial Japan. The Pacific War was predominantly a naval conflict, a struggle for supremacy over the vast stretches of the world's largest ocean, where the aircraft carrier quickly emerged as the decisive weapon. The war at sea, unlike the trench warfare of World War I or the mechanized battles of Europe, was characterized by long-range engagements, intense air-sea battles, and the brutal necessity of securing control over tiny, strategic islands. Following Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved a series of rapid and stunning victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in the initial months of 1942. They captured the Philippines, British Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, establishing a vast, formidable empire. Their military doctrine, heavily influenced by Bushido, emphasized aggressive offensives, the importance of honor, and a fanatical willingness to fight to the last man, which made their troops incredibly formidable and resistant to surrender. The Japanese Imperial Army, while disciplined and well-trained, often employed brutal tactics against civilians and prisoners of war, adhering to the infamous no-quarter policy. The turning point in the Pacific came in June of 1942 with the Battle of Midway, a decisive naval engagement considered one of the most important battles in naval history. The United States Navy, having broken Japanese naval codes, ambushed a large Japanese fleet, sinking 4 of Japan's most important aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in exchange for just one American carrier, the USS Yorktown. This crushing defeat crippled Japan's offensive naval capabilities, severely curtailing its ability to project power across the Pacific and halting its eastward expansion. From this point forward, the strategic initiative shifted to the Allies. The Allied strategy, primarily led by the United States, became one of island hopping or leapfrogging. Instead of directly attacking every Japanese-held island, the plan was to bypass heavily fortified enemy strongholds and seize strategically important islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases for the next advance. This approach minimized casualties and conserved resources while steadily advancing towards the Japanese home islands. Each island captured, however, came at a terrible cost. Battles like Guadalcanal August 1942 to February 1943, Tarawa November 1943, and Iwo Jima February to March 1945 were characterized by the extreme ferocity of the Japanese defense. Japanese soldiers would dig elaborate tunnel systems, fight from fortified bunkers, and often launch suicidal banzai charges rather than surrender, making every inch of ground a bloody struggle. Naval battles continued to rage across the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American naval aviators shoot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft, effectively destroying Japan's carrier-based air power. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the largest naval battle in history, dealt a catastrophic blow to the remaining Japanese fleet, marking the effective end of their capability to conduct large-scale naval operations. The sheer scale and technological sophistication of the American naval and air forces, coupled with their increasing mastery of carrier warfare, steadily overwhelmed the Japanese, pushing them relentlessly back towards their homeland. The human and material cost of these campaigns was immense, but the strategic progression of the island-hopping campaign was undeniable, bringing the war closer and closer to Japan's doorstep. Part 11: The Eastern Front and the Tide Turns in Europe. While the Pacific raged, the most brutal and devastating theater of the war unfolded on the Eastern Front, where Nazi Germany clashed with the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, unprovoked invasion of the Soviet Union, violating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was the largest land invasion in history, involving over 3 million Axis soldiers. Hitler's aim was to crush Bolshevism, destroy communism, and secure the vast agricultural lands and oil reserves of the Soviet Union for Lebensraum and the Aryan race. The initial German advance was stunningly successful, employing blitzkrieg tactics on an unprecedented scale. German forces swept deep into Soviet territory, encircling and destroying vast numbers of Soviet armies, and reaching the outskirts of Moscow by December of 1941. However, the vast distances, the brutal Russian winter, and the ferocious, often fanatical Soviet resistance, coupled with Hitler's strategic blunders, ultimately halted the German advance. The Battle of Moscow, fought from October 1941 to January 1942, marked the first major German defeat of the war. The tide definitively turned on the Eastern Front with the Battle of Stalingrad, fought from August 1942 to February 1943. This was a brutal, protracted urban battle that became a desperate struggle for every street and every building. The Soviet Red Army, under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, encircled the German Sixth Army, leading to its catastrophic defeat and the surrender of over 90,000 German soldiers. Stalingrad was a psychological and military turning point. It broke the back of the German army, marked the beginning of its long retreat, and proved that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Following Stalingrad, the Red Army launched a relentless counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back across vast distances. The Battle of Kursk in July of 1943, the largest tank battle in history, further solidified the Soviet advantage. The Soviets, aided by enormous quantities of supplies from the Western Allies through Lend-Lease, systematically liberated their territory, pushing the Germans westward towards Berlin. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, claiming millions of lives on both sides, with the Soviet Union bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine. By 1944, the Red Army was advancing steadily into Eastern Europe, liberating countries like Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and setting the stage for the final confrontation in Germany itself. Part 12: The Road to Defeat, Japan's Final Struggles. As the war in Europe drew to its brutal close, the full might of the Allied forces, particularly the United States, was brought to bear on Imperial Japan. The relentless island-hopping campaign in the Pacific had brought American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands, each step met with increasingly fanatical resistance. Battles like Iwo Jima February to March 1945 and Okinawa April to June 1945 became symbols of the desperate lengths to which the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy would go to defend their territory. On Iwo Jima, over 20,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the 8-square-mile island, with only just over 200 taken prisoner. On Okinawa, the last major battle of the war, over 70,000 American casualties were sustained, and an estimated 110,000 Japanese soldiers and between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians perished. The Japanese military's no-surrender doctrine, rooted in Bushido, meant that every island taken was at a horrific human cost for both sides. Facing overwhelming Allied air and naval superiority, Japan resorted to increasingly desperate tactics. The most notorious of these were the kamikaze attacks, beginning in earnest during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in late 1944. Young Japanese pilots, filled with fervent nationalist zeal, deliberately crashed their explosive-laden aircraft into Allied warships, sacrificing their lives in an attempt to halt the American advance. These suicidal attacks caused significant damage and instilled fear, but they could not turn the tide of the war. Despite these desperate measures, and the increasingly severe blockade that was strangling Japan's economy, the Japanese military leadership remained resolute in its refusal to surrender unconditionally, preparing for a final, catastrophic defense of the home islands that they believed would be their last stand. As the Allies contemplated a full-scale invasion of Japan, an operation codenamed Operation Downfall, which military planners estimated could result in millions of Allied casualties and many more Japanese deaths, a new, terrifying weapon was unveiled. On the 16th of July, 1945, the United States successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. President Harry S. Truman, aware of the horrific casualties that an invasion would entail, made the momentous decision to use this weapon to force Japan's unconditional surrender and hopefully avert a prolonged and bloody land invasion. On the 6th of August, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing approximately 70,000 people and causing widespread destruction. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, 1945, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 people. These two cataclysmic events, unprecedented in their destructive power, sent shockwaves through Japan's leadership. Simultaneously, on the 9th of August, the Soviet Union, having declared war on Japan, launched a massive invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, overwhelming Japanese forces there. Faced with utter devastation, the collapse of their last remaining armies on the continent, and the prospect of further atomic attacks, Emperor Hirohito, overriding the objections of hardline militarists, announced Japan's unconditional surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. The formal surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September, 1945, officially bringing World War II to an end. Part 13. The Aftermath of the Holocaust and Global Scars. The end of World War II in May of 1945 in Europe and September of 1945 in Asia brought the full, unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust to light for a shocked world. As the Allied forces, particularly the Soviet Red Army and Western Allied troops, liberated the concentration and extermination camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and countless others, they were confronted with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of the Nazi atrocities. The images of emaciated, skeletal survivors, of mountains of corpses, of gas chambers, and of ovens filled with human remains, shocked the world and left an indelible, eternal scar on human consciousness. Newsreel footage and photographs, distributed globally, forced humanity to confront the systematic barbarity that had transpired. For the Jewish people, the Holocaust was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, an attempt at total annihilation that remains unparalleled in human history. 6 million lives had been systematically murdered, representing 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe before the war. Families had been utterly destroyed, millennia-old communities had been completely decimated, and a rich cultural heritage was forever scarred. The survivors, often the sole remaining members of their families, faced immense challenges as they tried to rebuild their lives in the devastating aftermath of the genocide. Many were physically broken by years of starvation and torture, and almost all carried deep psychological wounds that would last a lifetime, manifesting as nightmares, flashbacks, and chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. Many Jewish survivors found themselves as displaced persons DPS, with no homes, families, or communities to return to, as their towns and villages had been destroyed or their former neighbors unwelcoming. They languished in overcrowded and often makeshift displaced persons DP camps across Europe, struggling daily to find adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The international community, reeling from the scale of the destruction, struggled to respond adequately to the immediate and long-term needs of these traumatized individuals. The profound trauma of the Holocaust was not merely physical but spiritual and psychological, leaving an enduring legacy of grief, loss, and an urgent imperative for remembrance. The establishment of the State of Israel in May of 1948 provided a crucial homeland and refuge for hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees and survivors seeking to escape the lingering anti-Semitism and instability in post-war Europe. However, many others chose to immigrate to the United States, Canada, Australia, and various other countries, seeking new lives and a chance to heal. The Holocaust had a profound and transformative impact on Jewish identity and culture globally. It led to a renewed emphasis on Jewish unity, collective memory, and the absolute necessity of survival, fostering a fervent global movement to ensure that such atrocities would never, ever happen again. The memory of the Holocaust continues to be meticulously commemorated, studied, and preserved through institutions like Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, serving as a solemn and eternal warning about the insidious dangers of hatred, racial prejudice, dehumanization, and unchecked totalitarian ideologies. Part 14. The Enduring Legacy of World War II and a New World Order. World War II was not merely a conflict, it was a cataclysmic watershed moment in human history, fundamentally reshaping the global political, economic, and social landscape for decades to come. The war resulted in the unfathomable deaths of tens of millions of people, soldiers, civilians, and victims of genocide, leaving entire continents scarred and societies traumatized. Cities across Europe and Asia, from London to Stalingrad, from Berlin to Tokyo, were reduced to unimaginable rubble, their once thriving urban centers decimated. Economies were shattered, industrial infrastructures were annihilated, and entire societies were transformed by the experience of total war. The war also served as a dark catalyst for unprecedented technological innovation. It accelerated the development of groundbreaking technologies, including sophisticated radar systems, the first operational jet aircraft, advanced rocketry, and, most terrifyingly, atomic weapons. These innovations not only had a lasting impact on warfare itself, but also irrevocably altered the course of scientific research and global power dynamics, ushering in the perilous nuclear age. The devastating power unleashed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated a new, existential threat to humanity. The Holocaust, the systematic, industrial-scale murder of 6 million Jews, stands as one of the darkest and most morally reprehensible chapters in human history. Its indelible mark serves as a stark, eternal reminder of the depths of human depravity and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked hatred, racial prejudice, and totalitarian ideologies. The Holocaust continues to be meticulously studied, commemorated, and memorialized, serving as a perpetual warning about the dangers of genocide and the imperative of universal human rights. The end of World War II also marked the dramatic shift in global power and the beginning of the Cold War. The Grand Alliance that had defeated the Axis powers fractured, giving way to a decades-long ideological, political, and geopolitical struggle between the two emerging superpowers, the democratic, capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. This rivalry shaped global politics for much of the second half of the 20th century, leading to proxy wars, ideological conflicts, a terrifying nuclear arms race, and a bipolar world order that threatened the very existence of humanity. In a profound response to the horrors of the war, World War II also spurred the creation of the United Nations in 1945, an ambitious international organization founded on the principles of collective security, diplomacy, and the promotion of peace and cooperation among nations. The UN, despite its limitations and the conflicting interests of its member states, has played a crucial role in addressing global challenges such as poverty, disease, humanitarian crises, and human rights abuses, providing a vital forum for international dialogue and collaboration. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948, was a direct response to the atrocities of the war, setting a global standard for the protection of individual liberties. The legacy of World War II continues to profoundly shape our world today. Its lessons about the insidious dangers of aggression, the imperative of international cooperation, the fragility of peace, and the absolute need to defend human rights and dignity against all forms of tyranny remain as relevant and urgent as ever. As we navigate the complex challenges of the 21st century, it is essential that humanity collectively remembers the profound lessons of the past, honors the sacrifices made, and strives relentlessly to build a more peaceful, just, and equitable future for all.